The Mojave Desert does not forgive mistakes. It does not soften its edges for the tired or the frightened. It does not care about the reasons a person ends up on his back roads running from something they cannot name out loud. It simply exists vast and indifferent baking fiery thing beneath its sun until the color bleeds out and only the bare essential shape of things remains. Lena Merritt had learned to love it for exactly that reason. 3 years earlier, she had driven west out of Phoenix with her 5-year-old daughter asleep in the back seat and $200 in her apron pocket. She had not told anyone where she was going. She had not looked in the rearview mirror once she crossed the county line. She had driven until the highway thinned and the gas gauge dropped, and the only light visible in any direction was the faded neon of a roadside diner sitting alone on a forgotten stretch of Route 93, blinking its stubborn little heartbeat into the dark Nevada sky. She had stopped. She had stayed. And over the years, the desert had slowly become the one thing in her life that had never lied to her. The diner was called the Dust and Ember. It had been called that when she bought it from an old man named Reg, who was tired of the heat and wanted to live near his grandchildren in Oregon. The sign was cracked along the bottom left corner, and the letter E in Ember flickered every time the temperature dropped below 70, which in August was never. The parking lot was gravel and caliche dust in the bleached skeleton of a cottonwood tree that had given up sometime in the late 90s. There were 6 booths inside a long counter with 8 stools, a pass-through window to the kitchen, and a single ceiling fan that moved the hot air around without actually cooling anything. It was not much, but it was hers, and it was safe, or at least it had been. The morning of the 23rd of August came in the way all desert mornings come in August, which is to say, it arrived without apology. The sun did not ease itself over the horizon. It simply appeared full and ferocious, turning the pale rock formations to the east into burning copper and flooding the valley floor with a heat that pressed down on everything like a physical weight. By 6 in the morning, the thermometer nailed to the porch post read 91 degrees. By 7, it had already climbed past 95. Lena was behind the counter when the day started, her dark hair pulled back with a rubber band she had found in the junk drawer, her apron already stained from the breakfast prep she had been doing since 5. She was not a tall woman. She was compact and precise in her movements, the way people become when they have spent years working in small spaces. Her face, when she let herself rest it for a moment, was the face of someone who had been beautiful once and was still beautiful now, but had stopped thinking about it a long time ago. There were lines at the corners of her eyes. There was a small scar above her left eyebrow from a parking lot in Phoenix she did not let herself think about anymore. Her hands, when she set down the coffee pot and pressed them flat against the counter, were steady. They had learned to be steady. She had 3 truckers in the first hour. 2 of them ordered the breakfast plate with eggs over easy and sausage links and did not look up from their phones. The third one, an older man with a Montana plate on his rig, asked for just coffee and pie and told her she made the best cherry pie he had found west of the Mississippi. She thanked him and refilled his cup twice and did not mention that the pie was from a commercial bakery in Henderson, and she had only heated it in the oven for 12 minutes. A person takes the kindness they are offered. By 8 o'clock, the truckers were gone and the diner was empty, and Lena stood at the pass-through window, looking out at the back lot where her daughter was playing. Ren Merritt was 8 years old, and she was the most serious 8-year-old that Lena had ever encountered, which was a fact that both frightened and amazed her mother in equal measure. Other children her age, the few she encountered when Lena drove the 40 miles to the nearest proper town, seemed to exist in a state of high-volume chaos. They ran, they shrieked, They cried about things and then forgot what the things were. Wren did none of these things. Wren observed. She moved through the world the way a naturalist might move through unfamiliar terrain quietly and with great attention cataloging what she found. She collected smooth stones and sorted them by color. She had taught herself to identify 16 species of desert bird from a field guide she had found in a box of donated books at the community center. She asked questions that Lena did not always know how to answer. That morning, she was building something in the dirt behind the diner, using a combination of flattened soda cans, sun-bleached river stones, and what appeared to be the remains of a broken plastic crate. She had been out there since 7, working with the quiet intensity of someone on a deadline that only she was aware of. She was wearing her pink windbreaker over her t-shirt despite the heat, which was a habit Lena had given up arguing about. Wren wore the pink windbreaker when she felt like wearing it, and that was the end of the discussion. Lena watched her for a moment through the pass-through window. She watched the small, serious face bent over the construction project. She watched the thin hands placing stones with deliberate precision. Something in her chest did what it always did when she watched her daughter, which was a complicated thing that had no clean name. Something between fierce love and a low, steady terror that she kept carefully managed and did not examine too closely. She turned back to the counter and began restocking the sugar dispensers. The afternoon passed the way desert afternoons pass in August, which is slowly and with great weight. 2 more trucks came and went. A family in a minivan from California stopped for cold drinks and to use the bathroom, the 2 small boys inside trailing through the diner like small, loud hurricanes, while their mother apologized and their father stood at the counter squinting at the menu as if it might change while he was looking at it. Lena brought them lemonade. Wren came inside for a sandwich around noon and then went back out with her windbreaker still on her pockets, full of the small stones she had selected from the morning's collection. By 4 in the afternoon, the sun had begun its slow, theatrical descent toward the western ridgeline, turning the sky above the valley from flat white to the particular shade of orange that Lena had come to associate with the Mojave's one daily moment of beauty. The temperature had peaked at 103. The highway was empty. The ceiling fan moved its slow, useless circles overhead. Lena was wiping down the far booth when the world outside the back window changed. She heard it before she understood what she was hearing. A sound like a scream from a machine. The high-pitched shriek of rubber against asphalt followed immediately by something lower and more terrible. A sound of mass and momentum meeting resistance. Metal striking rock with a force that sent the vibration through the building's cheap cinder block foundation and up through the soles of Lena's shoes. Then the horrible tumbling, that particular sequence of crashes that the body recognizes before the mind does, as something going very wrong in a very irreversible way. And then the thud. Heavy final, the kind of impact that means something large has come to rest. Then nothing. The desert swallowing the sound as if it had never been. Lena was out the back door before she had made a conscious decision to move. She stopped at the edge of the lot, hands shielding her eyes against the descending sun. The dust was still settling on the far shoulder of the highway. Down in the steep, rocky culvert 20 yards off the road, she could see the chrome catching the late light. A motorcycle, a large one, on its side. The front wheel was pointing in a direction that front wheels are not designed to point. She could not see the rider from where she was standing, but she could hear Wren. "Mom, down here. He is hurt." The voice was coming from the culvert. Wren's voice small and clear, and carrying the flat, factual tone she used when she had assessed a situation and reached a conclusion. Lena ran. The culvert was steep, and the loose gravel tore at her shoes as she half scrambled, half slid down the embankment. She could smell the hot oil before she reached the bottom, the acrid chemical burn of a machine bleeding out onto hot rock. The Harley-Davidson lay on its side 10 feet away, massive, and ruined. One saddlebag split open and spilling its contents across the caliche. The fuel line was weeping a dark stain into the pale dirt. The exhaust pipe ticked and sizzled. The man was 8 feet past the bike. He had been thrown clear, which was the only piece of luck that had touched him in the last 60 seconds. He was enormous, even lying on his back in the dirt, even broken and bleeding. The sheer physical scale of him was the first thing you registered. Well over 6 feet, shoulders that strained the seams of the heavy denim shirt he wore beneath his leather cut. The cut itself was filthy with road dust and blood, the back panel visible as he lay twisted slightly on his right side. The patch was a winged skull rendered in the kind of hard black ink that does not fade. Curved letters across the top, curved letters across the bottom, and in the center, rectangular and precise, a name patch. Colt. Wren was already kneeling beside him. She had both her small hands pressed hard against the right side of his torso, directly below his ribs where the blood was coming from in a way that was dark and continuous and deeply alarming. The pink windbreaker was balled between her palms and his body already saturated. Lena hit her knees in the gravel beside her daughter. The man's face was turned toward the sky. It was a face that had lived hard and long, and without apology for either of those facts. Old scars layered over new ones, a jaw like poured concrete, a gray beard short and rough dark with the blood from the gash above his right temple that was running freely down the side of his face and dripping off his chin into the dirt. His eyes were open. They were a pale, washed-out gray, the color of sky before a desert rain, and they were tracking, which meant he was conscious, which was the one piece of information Lena needed most in that moment. His left arm, the one she could see clearly from where she knelt, bore decades of tattooed history from wrist to shoulder. Most of it she did not register in the adrenaline surge of those first seconds. But one thing caught her eye. On the inside of the left wrist, small and deliberate among the larger work surrounding it, was the outline of a badge, federal, the kind with an eagle at the top. It had been crossed out with 2 heavy black lines done at some point long after the badge itself was inked. The crossing out was so thorough and so emphatic that it looked less like a correction and more like a statement. Lena registered it without understanding it, the way you register a detail that does not fit the frame, and filed it somewhere in the back of her mind where it would stay until she needed it. She pressed her own hands over Wren's, adding pressure. The man's eyes found her face. "Do not call the highway patrol." His voice was deep and rough and came out in pieces, interrupted by a wet sound in his chest that frightened her. "The ones around here, they are bought. The men in the black SUV, they were waiting for me." He swallowed with effort. His gray eyes were beginning to lose their focus at the edges, the way eyes do when the blood pressure is falling. Lena kept her hands on the wound. She looked at Wren. Wren was watching the man's face with the same still cataloging attention she brought to everything. "I am calling an ambulance," Lena said. "I have to." The man did not argue. He may not have had the strength. Instead, with a slowness that telegraphed the enormous effort it cost him, he reached inside the collar of his leather cut with his right hand. His fingers found something there. When they came out again, they were holding a small object wrapped tightly in oilskin canvas, bound with a short length of electrical tape, and a silver ring heavy and worn, with the letters HAMC cut deep into the band. He held them out toward Wren. Not toward Lena, toward Wren. Wren did not hesitate. She took her left hand off the wound, took the objects from his palm, and looked at him with those steady, serious eyes. He held her gaze. His voice dropped to something that was almost entirely breath. Hide those. Not the cops. Not anyone. When the club comes, you find Bishop. Only Bishop. He paused. His eyes closed and opened again. There is a place only Bishop knows. 3 words. Lena watched his lips move close to her daughter's ear as Ren leaned in. She could not hear what he said. 3 words spoken once. Ren listened the way she listened to everything, with her whole body still and her eyes focused on nothing in particular, the posture of a child committing something to permanent memory. Then his hand dropped. Lena dialed 911 with bloody fingers and gave the dispatcher the location in a voice that she forced into steadiness through sheer will. She kept pressure on the wound with her other hand the whole time. Ren stood up, turned away from the man's unconscious form without drama, and tucked the ring and the canvas-wrapped package into the deep front pocket of the pink windbreaker, with the focused efficiency of a small soldier following clear orders. Then she placed both hands back over her mother's and resumed pressing. The paramedics arrived in 14 minutes. The State Highway Patrol arrived in 19. In the desert dark of that August evening, with the red and blue lights painting the culvert in a sickly, rotating glow, the man the bikers called Colt was loaded onto a gurney with an oxygen mask over his face and a paramedic calling out numbers in a voice that did not sound optimistic. A state trooper, young and angular, with a face like the blade of a shovel, questioned Lena beside her own back door for 22 minutes. He wanted to know if the biker had spoken to her, if he had given her anything, if she had seen the vehicle that caused the accident. She answered each question honestly, except the one about whether he had given her anything. And to that one she said no in a voice that she had been practicing without knowing it for 3 years, which was the same voice she had used in the kitchen of the house in Phoenix when Greer's business partner called at 11 at night, and she answered and said, "Everything is fine." Ren sat on the rear bumper of the trooper's cruiser, wrapped in a silver emergency blanket, watching everything with quiet brown eyes, and said nothing at all. The trooper made a note in his pad. He looked at the diner at the back lot at the dark highway. Then he got in his car and left. The night closed back in around the dust and ember like water filling a hole. Lena did not sleep. She put Ren to bed at 9 o'clock after a bath that turned the water gray with desert dust. Ren did not ask questions about what had happened. She brushed her teeth and changed into her pajamas and put the pink windbreaker on the chair beside her bed, which was where she always put it, and got under the covers and looked up at the water-stained ceiling with the expression of someone working through a complex problem in private. "Good night, baby," Lena said from the doorway. "Good night, Mom." She watched her daughter's eyes close. She listened to the breathing slow and deepen. Then she closed the door softly and went back to the kitchen and sat at the small table with a glass of water she did not drink and tried to think. Around midnight, she could not stop herself anymore. She went to Ren's room. The windbreaker was on the chair exactly where it had been. The ring was in the right front pocket. The canvas-wrapped package was in the left. She took both items to the kitchen and set them under the fluorescent light above the stove, which was the brightest light in the building at this hour. The ring was old silver, the kind that goes dark and grainy in the deep cuts of the engraving. HAMC. She had grown up in California. She knew what those letters meant. She set it on the counter. The canvas bundle was bound tightly, but the tape peeled back without resistance. Inside was a notebook, small, perhaps 4 inches by 6. Black leather cover, soft with handling, and stained dark along the spine. She opened it. The first page had a date from 2 years ago at the top, and then a column of entries, initials, numbers, what appeared to be routing codes for financial institutions. The handwriting was small and cramped and careful, the handwriting of a person who understood that these pages might eventually be read by people who were not him. She turned the pages. There were more dates, more initials, dollar amounts that climbed progressively as she moved toward the back of the notebook numbers, with enough zeros behind them that she had to count them twice to be sure she was reading them right. There were names, some were written as initials only, but others further back, perhaps written at a point when the author was growing confident that the noose was tightening and the timeline was nearly complete, were spelled out in full. County officials, a sitting state senator, three names from the sheriff's department that she recognized from the signs along the highway, the ones with the official photograph and the authoritative expression that were supposed to communicate safety to the people who drove past them. And then she turned to the third to last page. The name was there in the same careful, cramped handwriting as everything else. It was not abbreviated. It was not protected by initials. It was written out in full with a routing number beside it and a dollar amount beside that, and a notation in parentheses that read financial architecture, and that was all. Greer Holt. The glass of water hit the floor because her hand had stopped working. She did not notice. The blood had left her face so completely that the fluorescent light made her look like something already gone. She stared at the name for a long time without blinking. She had believed, or told herself she believed, or told herself she had constructed something close enough to belief that she could function, that Greer Holt was in federal custody. That had been the story 3 years ago. That was what the assistant prosecutor had told her when she came in to give her statement after Greer was arrested, sitting in a beige conference room with a paper cup of bad coffee growing cold between her palms, being told very carefully and in very measured language that her husband was cooperating and would likely serve reduced time in a minimum security facility, and that she was not a target of the investigation and she was free to go. Free to go. She had taken her daughter and a bag of clothes and she had gone. And she had not looked back because she had told herself there was nothing behind her that she needed to fear. The thing was caught. The thing was contained. The desert was quiet and empty, and hers. The notebook said otherwise. She read the notation again. Financial architecture. She understood with the cold clarity that sometimes arrives after the initial shock has done its worst exactly what those two words meant. Greer Holt was not a peripheral figure in a network that had been exposed and dismantled. Greer Holt had built the network. He had drawn the blueprints, laid the foundations, designed the invisible channels through which the money moved in one end and emerged clean and untraceable on the other side. He had not been caught 3 years ago. He had been briefly inconvenienced. He had traded a name, probably several names, probably the names of people who could be sacrificed without disrupting the underlying architecture he had spent years designing. And then at some point he had been returned to circulation. The routing number beside his name was dated 14 months ago. Greer Holt was free. He was active. And on the stretch of highway outside this diner tonight, the people who were trying to bury the evidence of what he had built had run a man off the road and nearly killed him. And that man had given his evidence to her 8-year-old daughter. She sat down on the kitchen floor because her legs were finished. She sat with her back against the cabinet and the notebook in her lap and the silver ring cold on the tile beside her, and she breathed. In the way that a person breathes when the alternative is something they cannot afford to let happen. Slow, deliberate. One breath as a unit of time, and the next breath as another unit, building them up like walls until there was enough structure to think. They would come looking, not in some abstract future sense. They would come looking in the specific material immediate sense. The men in the black SUV had not run Colt off the road on impulse. They had been waiting for him. Someone had told them his route. Someone inside the club, the thought arrived, and she held it at arm's length for a moment before accepting it. Someone inside knew where he was going, which meant the people who wanted this notebook were organized and patient and had resources embedded in places they were not supposed to be embedded. The highway patrol trooper who had questioned her tonight, who had asked twice whether the biker had given her anything, who had watched her face when she answered. She thought about his car idling at the mouth of the culvert for a long time before it pulled away. She thought about the slow way it had moved down Route 93 as if it was not entirely finished with the area yet. She thought about Captain Rawlings from the county sheriff's department who had driven out here 14 months ago in an unmarked car and sat at her counter and ordered coffee he did not drink and talked in the pleasant, oblique way of a man making a threat that he could technically deny making, and suggested that a woman running a business in his county might want to think about goodwill and community relationships and the kinds of problems that tended to find their way to businesses that did not cultivate the right friendships with the right people. She had given him nothing. She had said nothing. He had left $3 for the coffee on the counter and driven away, and she had told herself he would not be back. His name was not in the notebook, or at least she had not found it yet. She went back through the pages with fresh eyes, page by page, and on the fifth page from the front, she found it rendered in initials only. R.H.C. Rawlings, H for his middle name, that she could not remember right now. Captain. She pressed her forehead against her knees and held the notebook against her chest in the dark kitchen and listened to the desert wind move against the tin roof of the dust and ember. She would go. That was the decision. She had made it before under worse conditions with fewer resources and a 5-year-old instead of an 8-year-old, and she had survived. She would pack the 2 duffel bags. She would open at 6 as usual because not opening would be its own kind of signal. She would take the morning's cash from the register, whatever the truckers brought her in those first hours, and she would be on Route 93 heading north before noon. Oregon, maybe further. There were places that had no connection to anyone who knew her name. She would leave the notebook on the counter. She would leave the ring. She would take Ren, and she would go. The decision was clean, and she held on to it. She did not sleep. She packed the bags instead, moving quietly through the diner and the small, attached living quarters, in the practiced way of a woman who had done this before. Ren's things were compact. The children of people who moved develop a talent for traveling light. Books, a few changes of clothes, the field guide for desert birds, the pouch of selected stones from the back lot, the smooth ones in the specific colors that Ren had deemed acceptable for transport. At 2 in the morning, she found herself standing in the doorway of Ren's room, looking at her daughter sleeping with the covers kicked to the end of the bed and one arm thrown over her face in the loose, total way that only children and the truly exhausted sleep. The pink windbreaker was on the chair. The notebook and the ring sat on the kitchen counter where Lena had left them. She thought about the 3 words that the man in the culvert had whispered into her daughter's ear. The 3 words she had not heard. Whatever they were, Ren had not told her. Ren had come inside and eaten her sandwich and gone back out to her stones and had not volunteered anything. And Lena had not asked because she had been very carefully not thinking about the objects in the windbreaker pocket for the remainder of the afternoon. She thought about his eyes as his hand dropped the way they had gone from fierce to empty in a matter of seconds, and about Ren's small hands continuing to press without being asked to. She went back to the kitchen and sat down and waited for the morning. At 5:45, she unlocked the front door of the Dust and Ember and turned the neon sign on and started the coffee. The sky was still a deep pre-dawn purple in the west, although the east was already burning. Route 93 was empty in both directions. The desert was in that brief, specific state of apparent quiet that it reaches only in those minutes between the end of night and the full arrival of morning before the heat begins its daily campaign. Wren came out of her room at 6 in her pajamas, which she did not immediately change out of, which was an unspoken communication that something felt different about this morning. She moved through the kitchen quietly, the way she moved through everything, and Lena watched from the counter as Wren stopped at the stove and looked at the ring and the notebook sitting in the fluorescent light where Lena had placed them hours before. Wren picked up both items without a word, without being asked, and put the canvas package and the ring into the left front pocket of the pink windbreaker that she had retrieved from the chair in her room. She zipped the pocket closed. Then she put the windbreaker over her arm and came to sit at the counter and ate cereal and looked at the two duffel bags sitting against the wall by the door. "Are we leaving?" she asked. "Yes," Lena said. "Today. After the morning rush." Wren ate another spoonful of cereal. She thought about something. "The man who Bishop is," Wren said. "Will he know to come here?" Lena stopped moving. The coffee pot was in her hand. "What makes you think Bishop is coming here?" Wren considered the question with the same focused patience she brought to the stone classification project. "Colt said the club protects its own," Wren said. "He said if Bishop comes, give it to him." He said it like Bishop was already coming. Lena set the coffee pot down very carefully. The morning light was coming through the front windows, now thick and orange and relentless, laying itself across the vinyl booths and the dusty jukebox in the corner, and the cracked formica of the counter where 3 years of mornings had been spent in the particular stubborn piece of a life rebuilt from rubble. She looked at the duffel bags by the door. She looked at her daughter's serious face above the cereal bowl, and then she felt it. Before she understood what it was. A frequency more than a sound registered in the sternum before the ears could categorize it. The coffee in the glass pot on the burner began to tremble, a slow, glassy shimmer across the surface. The silverware on the nearest table shifted against the formica with a tiny metallic whisper. Lena walked to the front window. She pressed her hand against the glass and looked south down Route 93 toward the long, flat horizon where the highway disappeared into the heat shimmer. Something was coming over that horizon, a dark mass still distant, still resolving itself out of the morning glare, and from it growing louder with each passing second that sound. Low and guttural, and building from the road itself, from the ground beneath the road, from some place below, and older than the road until it was no longer a frequency she felt in her chest, but a sound she heard with her whole body. The thunder of 150 engines riding side by side under the Nevada sun. Wren had come to stand beside her. The small, serious face was tilted slightly upward, watching the dark mass on the horizon the way she watched a storm coming in from the west. It was too late to run. They both knew it. The bags by the door were irrelevant now. Lena put her arm around her daughter's thin shoulders and held on. The Hells Angels of the Arizona Nomads, and of California and Nevada and Washington, and every road between them came over the horizon and kept coming, and the desert morning shook with the weight of them, and the dust and embers stood in their path, small and stubborn, blinking its cracked neon sign into the terrible, beautiful roar. They came in a single column stretching back along Route 93 farther than the eye could separate individual machines from the mass of them. The sound had gone past sound now. It was something the body processed differently than hearing something that pressed against the rib cage and made the back teeth ache. The windows of the dust and ember vibrated in their frames. The neon sign above the door swung on its bracket. Somewhere behind the counter, a coffee mug walked itself to the edge of a shelf and fell. Lena did not move from the window. The column was slowing. It split and widened as it reached the gravel lot, bikes peeling off to the left and right, With the practiced automatic coordination of men who had ridden together long enough, that individual thought had been replaced by something older and more efficient. They filled the lot completely and kept going, spreading along both shoulders of the highway, parking in precise diagonal lines that blocked Route 93 in both directions as thoroughly as a wall. Chrome and leather in the rolling heat distortion of 150 engines that had been running since before the sun was fully up. Then in a rolling wave that moved from the highway inward, the engines cut. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Lena had ever heard. Dust moved through the lot in slow, purposeful clouds. Kickstands dropped in a sequence that sounded like a slow mechanical applause. Men dismounted. They were large, most of them, with the particular physical density of people who have spent their lives doing physical things in physical environments. The cuts on their backs showed patches from California and Arizona and Nevada and further Washington state, New Mexico colors that had been earned on roads she had never traveled through situations she did not want to imagine. They formed up without being directed to form up, which was somehow more frightening than if someone had been giving orders. It implied that this was rehearsed, that this was a thing they had done before. A path opened through the center of them, wide enough for one man to walk. He was already moving. Bishop was 55 years old, and he carried every year of it in the forward lean of his shoulders and the particular quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a machine running at a frequency too low to detect until it was directly beside you. He was broad across the back in the way of a man who had been built that way young and had maintained it through decades of labor. His hair was gray at the temples and silver through the beard, which was cropped close to the jaw. The scar that ran from his left temple down to the line of his jaw was old and fully healed, the kind of scar that has become so incorporated into a face that removing it would leave something incomplete. He walked the way men walk when they have made a decision, and the decision is not subject to revision. Lena stepped back from the window. She turned to Ren, who was still standing where she had been watching through the glass with her arms at her sides, and her expression doing that thing it did where it revealed nothing and contained everything simultaneously. "Pantry," Lena said. "Behind the flour sacks, you do not come out." Ren looked at her mother for a moment. Then she looked back at the lot. Then she walked to the pantry at the back of the kitchen and went inside and pulled the door most of the way closed behind her, leaving a gap of perhaps 2 inches that aligned precisely with the angle needed to see through to the front counter. Lena positioned herself behind the register. Her right hand found the handle of the cast iron skillet she had placed under the counter at some point in the last hour without consciously deciding to. The weight of it was a small, inadequate comfort. She pressed her palm flat against the grip and waited. The front door opened. The bell above it chimed once, the small, ordinary sound deeply wrong in the context of what surrounded it. Then the deadbolt which she had thrown met the door frame and held for exactly the duration of one breath before the door came in. Anyway, the lock mechanism torn entirely out of the wood frame with a single flat kick that sent splinters across the linoleum. The bell swung twice more on its bracket and went still. 4 men came in first. They took positions without discussion, 2 flanking the door, 2 moving to block the back hallway. They did not draw anything. They did not need to. They stood with the patient, immovable quality of load-bearing architecture, and that was sufficient. Bishop walked to the counter. He stopped 6 feet back from it. He looked at Lena the way a man looks at a landscape he is assessing for weather, taking in information without immediately organizing it into anything verbal. His eyes were dark brown, nearly black in the diner light, set deep under a brow that suggested long practice at holding a neutral expression in front of people who very much wanted to see a different one. He looked around the diner. The booths, the jukebox, the photograph of the Nevada high desert in a wooden frame behind the counter that had come with the place when she bought it. He took his time. "You the owner," he said. It was not a question, but it was not hostile either. It was the voice of a man gathering facts. "Yes," Lena said. Her own voice surprised her with its steadiness. Bishop placed both hands on the counter, not threateningly, just present. Large calloused hands with old ink on the knuckles, the kind of tattoos that blur into each other over decades until they are less individual images than an accumulated texture of a particular kind of life. "My sergeant at arms," he said. "His name is Colt. He was found off the back of your property last night." "I called the ambulance," Lena said. "We found him, we helped him. I did not see who ran him off the road." Bishop was quiet for a moment. The four men behind him did not move. "I know you did not see who ran him off the road," Bishop said, "because if you had, you would not be standing here having this conversation." He paused. Colt was carrying something that belongs to the club, something that was not on him when the paramedics brought him in. "I don't know what you are talking about," Lena said. The words came out clean. 3 years of practice. The voice that had learned to be flat and smooth under questioning, the voice she had developed in beige conference rooms and on porches in Phoenix when cars she did not recognize idled too long at the end of the driveway. It was a good voice. It had kept her alive. Bishop studied her face for a long moment. His expression did not change. Then he reached into his cut with his right hand, and what came out was a knife, 10 inches, fixed blade. He set it on the counter between them, not as a weapon drawn, but as a fact placed down. The blade caught the light from the fluorescent tube overhead and threw a thin, bright line across the wall behind her. "Don't," he said quietly. His voice had not risen. It had done the opposite, dropping to something below conversational, below the threshold that required effort to hear. "Don't lie to me in my brother's blood. We know the little girl took something from Colt before the troopers arrived. We have people in this county everywhere. Bring her out, or my brothers and I take this building apart board by board and find it ourselves." From behind the pantry door, the small hinges made their sound. Wren came out of the hallway. She was still in her pajamas. She was carrying the pink windbreaker folded over her left arm, the zipped pocket containing the canvas package and the ring, a small rectangular weight visible against the fabric. She crossed the linoleum in bare feet and stopped at the end of the counter, 5 feet from Bishop's left side. She looked up at him with the same level measuring attention she had directed at the desert for the last 3 years. Lena came out from behind the counter. One of the men by the hallway moved with her, not touching her, just moving alongside her in a way that communicated that her range of motion had a defined boundary. She stopped 6 feet from her daughter with the cast iron skillet still in her hand because she had forgotten to put it down, and now it seemed wrong to draw attention to it by setting it aside. Bishop turned from the counter to look at the girl. Something moved in his face. It was brief and he controlled it quickly, but it was there, that involuntary adjustment that happens when something surprises a man who has trained himself to not be surprised. He looked at the pajamas and the bare feet and the windbreaker held with the quiet certainty of a child who had been given a job and had taken the job seriously. He came down to one knee. The heavy leather of his riding pants creaked. He was still very large, even kneeling still above the girl's eye level, but less so. He looked at her with those dark, still eyes. "Who are you?" he said. "I am Wren," she said. "Colt told me to find Bishop." He said only Bishop. Bishop was quiet for a moment. Something worked through his expression. "I am Bishop," he said. Wren nodded as though this confirmed what she had already established for herself. "He said you would come," she said. She unzipped the windbreaker pocket and held out the ring first. Colt said to give you this. Bishop took the ring from her palm. He turned it over once in his fingers, looking at the engraving, the worn band, the places where the silver had gone dark from years of contact with skin. He closed his hand around it and held it for a moment with his eyes down. When he opened his hand again, the ring was on his right hand, the third finger where it fit with the ease of something returning to the place it had always been meant to occupy. He is in the hospital right now, Bishop said. Fighting hard, the paramedic said the pressure you kept on the wound was the reason he made it to the table. You understand what I am telling you. Wren considered this with the same steady attention. I kept pressing, she said, even after it got through the jacket. Bishop looked at her for a long moment. I know you did, he said. He stood. He held out his hand for the canvas package. Wren took it from the pocket and placed it in his palm without hesitation. He unfolded the oilskin, carefully peeling back the electrical tape, unrolling the canvas on the counter beside the knife he had set there. The notebook lay on the cloth, small and black and dense, with 2 years of a man's most dangerous work. Bishop opened it. He did not read quickly. He moved through the pages methodically, the way a man reads something he has been waiting for long enough that he is not going to let urgency make him careless. Lena watched his face. It was controlled and gave very little away except at one point toward the middle of the notebook where his eyes stopped moving across the page, where they went back, where they read the same section again. He did not look up immediately. He stood very still with the notebook open in front of him and his eyes fixed on a specific entry, and the silence in the room became a different kind of silence than it had been before. Axel, he said. He said it quietly. The name was not directed at the room. It was directed inward, the way a man says the name of something he has been afraid of finding confirmed. The man standing to Bishop's left, the one who had been closest to him since they walked in, shifted his weight. He was younger than Bishop by a decade thick, through the chest and neck, with a vice president patch on his left breast, and the careful, attentive expression of a man who has spent years learning to position himself advantageously in rooms where decisions are being made. His name was Axel. Lena had not known that until this moment. Bishop did not look at him yet. He looked at the notebook. Then he closed it with a clean, deliberate motion, folded the canvas back over it, and put it in the inside pocket of his cut close to his body. Then he looked at Axel. Whatever was communicated in that look passed too quickly for Lena to fully read it, but she saw Axel receive it, saw the fraction of a second where the carefully maintained surface of his expression developed a crack before he sealed it back over. His hands, which had been loose at his sides, became still in a slightly different way. The stillness of containment rather than ease. Bishop held Axel's gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned back to Lena without saying anything more about it, and the 2 men nearest to Axel moved without any visible signal from Bishop to positions that were closer to the vice president than they had been before. Not obviously, just closer. Lena watched this. She filed it in the same place she had filed the crossed-out badge tattoo on Colt's wrist. The place in the back of the mind where things wait until you understand what to do with them. Bishop looked at her. His voice came back to something more conversational, though the underlying register of absolute authority beneath it had not changed. This book is 2 years of work, he said. 2 years of one man riding alone into places that would have killed him twice over if anyone had known what he was building. Everything in here goes to the right people, and a significant number of men who have been using our name and our roads to move poison into this state are going to spend the rest of their lives in a federal institution. He paused. Colt risked everything to get this notebook out of the county, and the people who wanted it buried ran him off your road. I know, Lena said quietly. Bishop looked at her. a question in the look. "I read it," she said. "Last night. I know what is in it." The room adjusted itself around that statement. Two of the men by the door shifted. The one nearest to the back hallway made a small sound that was not quite a word. "Then you know why we needed it," Bishop said. "I know," she said again. And then because it was the thing she had been carrying since 2 in the morning, and the weight of it was becoming something she could not continue to manage alone, "I also know one of the names in there. Greer Holt. He is my ex-husband." Bishop did not react visibly. "I thought he was in custody," she said. "I moved out here 3 years ago because I thought he was in custody." The notation in the notebook. Financial architecture. The routing number is from 14 months ago. He is not in custody. He has not been in custody for some time. Bishop was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "he is not." Lena absorbed this confirmation. It landed the way things land when you already know them and are waiting for someone else to say them out loud so they become real. "He is in Tucson," Bishop said. "He has been consulting for Rawlings in the cartel money structure for approximately the last year. He is the reason the financial side of this operation has been as difficult to trace as it has." His voice was level and factual, the voice of a man reporting an assessment, not offering comfort. He looked at her with what might have been something close to respect. "You ran from the wrong end of it. You ran right into the middle." "I know that now," Lena said. Wren had been standing quietly through this exchange, tracking the conversation with her eyes moving between the adults in the room the way she tracked a weather front, watching for the thing beneath the visible surface that would tell her what was actually coming. Then the ground changed. Not the vibration of motorcycles this time. Something different. Higher frequency. Harder. The sound of large American V8 engines running fast and with purpose decelerating sharply as they left the asphalt and hit gravel. The particular sound of heavy doors opening before vehicles had fully stopped. Bishop's head turned toward the highway with the instant total attention of a man whose internal threat assessment system has been running without interruption for 30 years. Every man in the diner moved at once. Outside, the Hells Angels reacted without a word spoken between them. The loose, waiting quality of their formation evaporated. Hands went to leather cuts. The sound of metal on metal, the dry mechanical language of weapons being checked and readied, moved through the parking lot in a wave. They closed ranks, tightening the perimeter around the front of the building until they stood shoulder to shoulder, a solid line of leather and chrome and absolute intent facing the highway. Three black Chevrolet Suburbans had come off Route 93 in a hard turn that kicked up a rooster tail of cliché dust 20 feet high. They sat at odd angles in the gravel lot, engines still running, blocked from going further by the wall of bikers in front of them. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the doors came open. 12 men, tactical vests over civilian clothes, no insignia, no badge numbers, faces covered by dark balaclavas. Assault rifles at the low ready, the practiced patient grip of men who have trained with what they are carrying. They spread out from the Suburbans in a loose formation that put the lead vehicle between them and the largest concentration of bikers. Leading them was a man in a dark vest with a Remington shotgun held across his body at port arms, the shell already chambered, the muzzle angled just below horizontal with the particular casual readiness of someone who does not intend to have to raise it very far. Lena knew his face. She had known it for 14 months since the afternoon he sat at her counter and drank none of his coffee and talked about community relationships. Captain Rawlings, 48 years old, heavy through the jaw and the neck with flat light eyes that had the quality of surfaces. Rather than depths, the eyes of a man who had stopped examining his own interior some time ago and found the decision comfortable. He was out of uniform. He had not been in uniform since the last time he drove out here, which was also the first time, because the things he did when he came to the Dust and Ember were not things that a uniform was meant to witness. He walked to the front of the formation and stopped looking out at the wall of bikers. Preacher. His voice was constructed for projection, the practiced bellow of a man accustomed to large spaces and adversarial audiences. Bishop, whatever name you go by. Bishop walked to the shattered front doorway. He stepped through the broken frame onto the small porch and stood with both hands visible and empty, the notebook a rectangular presence in his inside pocket that Lena imagined Rawlings could see from 30 yards away, even through leather. Rawlings worked the shotgun slightly in his hands, not raising it, just acknowledging its presence. "This does not have to involve the club," Rawlings said. Colt stuck his nose into something that was running smooth for 3 years before he started picking at the edges. He got what came from that. You hand over whatever he was carrying, your brothers ride back to wherever they came from, and we forget this morning ever happened. Bishop said nothing. Rawlings looked at the building. His flat eyes moved across the front windows with a deliberate, taking inventory quality. "We know the woman and the kid saw our faces," he said. "Don't make us go through you to get to them." And then he looked directly at the doorway, directly past Bishop, directly at Lena, who was standing 8 feet back from the entrance with her daughter's hand in hers. He said it in a normal voice, not raised, as if it were simply the next thing on a list of items to be addressed. "Greer sends his regards." The words hit her physically. She felt Wren's hand tighten in hers. Rawlings was still looking at her. He was telling her something with the look, the way a man tells you something he cannot say in front of witnesses, communicating it instead through the specific quality of his attention. He was telling her that this was never entirely about the notebook. The notebook was the reason they were here this morning with 12 rifles and 3 Suburbans. But she was the reason Rawlings himself had come. Greer Holt had sent him for the notebook and for something else, for the loose end of her. The thing she had tried to outrun for 3 years had arrived. It had driven up Route 93 in a black Suburban, and it knew her name, and it was standing in her parking lot with a shotgun and her ex-husband's regards. She looked at her daughter's face. Wren was looking back at her with those serious, cataloging eyes, and in them, Lena saw not fear but the same steady problem-solving attention that had pressed a pink windbreaker against a stranger's wound without being asked. She thought about what she was holding. Not the canvas package which was in Bishop's pocket, not the ring, something else. 3 words that Colt had spoken into her daughter's ear in the dirt of a desert culvert, words that Wren had held in private memory for 14 hours without being told, to the way she held the names of the 16 species of desert bird, the way she held everything that mattered. She looked down at Wren. Wren was already looking up at her, and in the look was the question, not whether to tell, whether now was the time, whether this was the moment Colt had been preparing for when he spent the last of his fading consciousness on 3 words given to an 8-year-old girl. Bishop Wren said, her voice was small in the large silence, but it was clear. It carried the quality of something that intends to be heard. Bishop turned from the doorway. He looked at the girl. Wren let go of her mother's hand. She walked to Bishop and stopped in front of him and looked up. She reached up and put her hand on his forearm, and he bent toward her with the deliberate care of a very large man in the presence of something very small and important. She spoke 3 words into the space beside his ear. Lena watched his face as she did. He did not react immediately. He held very still. The control that had been there since he walked into the diner maintained its surface for 3, 4, 5 seconds. Then something shifted behind his eyes, not surprise exactly. Something more like recognition. the specific expression of a man who has been waiting for a key and has just felt it turn. He straightened. He looked at Ren for a moment with an expression that Lena had not seen on his face before and could not entirely categorize except that it contained something that did not belong on the face of the president of a motorcycle club standing in a doorway with 12 assault rifles aimed at his chest. Something closer to gratitude. He reached into his cut and pulled out his phone. He turned away from the doorway and moved to the far wall of the diner, his back to the room, and worked the phone with both thumbs for 40 seconds in the focused, unhurried manner of a man who knows exactly what he is sending and to whom. The four men inside the diner had closed tighter around Lena and Ren without making it look like they were doing anything other than standing. The effect was that they were surrounded by a barrier of leather and deliberate stillness. And for the first time since the engines had cut outside, Lena felt something that was not yet safety, but was adjacent to it. Something like being inside a wall rather than outside one. She pulled Ren against her side and held her there. Bishop finished with the phone. He put it back in his cut. He stood at the far wall for a moment with his eyes closed, which was strange, which was the gesture of a man doing something internal. Something like prayer or preparation or a very fast private accounting of the costs and stakes of the next 5 minutes. Then he opened his eyes and walked back to the front door. He stepped out onto the porch. "Rawlings," he said. His voice carried easily across the lot to where the captain stood by the lead Suburban with his Remington and his 12 armed men. There was no effort in the projection. It was simply large. Rawlings shifted the shotgun upward slightly in his hands. "You brought 12 men and 3 trucks to my brother's road, and you ran him into a ditch and left him for dead," Bishop said. "And now you are standing in our lot telling me this does not involve the club." He paused. "Everything that touches this road involves the club." He let that sit for a moment in the hot morning air. "The Ledger Colt was carrying. I have had it for 20 minutes. I've photographed every page with an encrypted phone and sent the images to the FBI Internal Affairs Office in Washington approximately 4 minutes ago." He pulled the phone from his pocket and held it up. The screen faced Rawlings from 30 yards away. Lena could not see what it showed from where she was standing, but she saw Rawlings see it, saw the way the captain's jaw changed. "I also sent a copy to the Financial Crimes Desk at the Los Angeles field office and to the chief investigative editor at the Los Angeles Times because some stories deserve 2 audiences." The parking lot was absolutely silent except for the idling of the Suburban engines. "The offshore accounts tied to the names in that notebook will be flagged by federal system monitoring before noon," Bishop said. "The cartel contacts in Sonora, whose supply chain you have been facilitating, will see those flags. They will understand what the flags mean in terms of their operational security. They will draw their own conclusions about who is responsible for the exposure." His voice had dropped, now losing the projection and becoming something that required the silence of the lot to carry, which meant Rawlings had to stand still and let it reach him. "You have 12 men, some rivals, and about 3 hours before the people who actually frighten you start looking for someone to hold accountable." He looked at the captain. "Shoot me if you want. The physics of this lot do not change if you do. But consider what you are buying with that shot, because whatever you take from me in the next 30 seconds, the data is already gone." Rawlings was very still. His flat eyes worked through what he had heard. Lena could see it from the diner doorway, the particular visible quality of a man recalculating, in real time, moving pieces across a board that had just been substantially rearranged. His hands on the shotgun were white at the knuckles. Then he looked to his left. Axel had moved. He had moved in the time since Bishop had stepped onto the porch, shifting through the interior of the diner, toward the back hallway, toward the position that would put him closest to the pathway between Rawlings' men and the place where Lena and Wren were standing. It was a small movement, a repositioning. In a different room, in a different situation, it might have meant nothing. But two of Bishop's men had been watching Axel since Bishop had closed the notebook and said his name. They moved the instant he did. Lena saw Axel's arms go up and back in the practiced, immediate way of a man who has been restrained before and knows that the geometry of resistance is not currently in his favor. The two men held him without violence, without drama, without a word spoken. They simply stopped him from going anywhere. Axel stood with his arms held and looked toward the doorway where Bishop stood, and the expression on his face in that moment was something Lena would carry for a long time afterward without fully being able to put language to it. Not guilt exactly, or not only guilt. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who has made a series of decisions that seemed individually manageable and has only now, in the specific quality of Bishop's silence, arrived at the full sum of what they cost. Bishop looked back from the porch. He looked at Axel in the hands of his two men. He looked at him for a long moment from across the width of the diner. The verdict in Bishop's eyes was not anger. It was something colder and more total than anger. It was the withdrawal of something that could not be restored, the closing of an account that had been open for years and was now permanently shut. He said nothing to Axel. He simply looked at him with that final, irrevocable expression and then turned back to the lot. Outside, Rawlings was doing the arithmetic. He looked at his 12 men. He looked at the wall of Hell's Angels surrounding the lot, the chains and the cold eyes and the hands at waistbands, the absolute flat readiness of men who had decided before driving out here this morning that this was a morning they were prepared to die on. He looked at Bishop standing on the porch with his hands empty and his face holding the particular expression of a man who has released the outcome and is no longer afraid of it. Rawlings looked at his phone. He looked at the Squamirdunk. He lowered the Remington. The tactical team read the drop in his posture before he spoke. Two of them had already begun the infinitesimal backward lean that precedes retreat. When Rawlings said fall back, his voice came out wrong, flattened by something that was not quite disbelief but was adjacent to it, the voice of a man saying a thing that his body is performing before his mind has entirely consented to it. The 12 men moved toward the Suburbans with a speed that was not quite running, but was not walking either. Doors opened and closed. Engines that had been idling revved hard. The three Suburbans reversed across the gravel with their tires spinning, kicking up the caliche dust in a high pale cloud that the morning sun turned briefly golden before the wind carried it south along the highway shoulder. They were gone in 40 seconds. The dust settled. The Hells Angels did not cheer. They did not move. They stood in the lot in the long morning light and watched the highway where the Suburbans had been and let the silence rebuild itself around them with the patient, seasoned quality of men who know that a departure is not the same as a conclusion. Bishop came back through the broken front door. He stood in the middle of the diner and looked at Lena and Wren, who had not moved from the spot where they had been standing since Rawlings arrived. Wren's hand was back in her mother's. The pink windbreaker was folded over Wren's free arm. Lena looked at this man who had broken her front door and held a knife against her counter and was now the reason she was alive, and she found that she did not have immediate access to any of the responses that the situation seemed to call for. Not relief, not anger, not gratitude, not yet. Just the bare fact of standing upright and breathing and still holding her daughter's hand. Bishop looked at Wren for a moment. Colt chose right, he said quietly. He said it to himself as much as to the room. He pulled the phone from his cut again and looked at the screen. His expression did something that was not quite a smile. Whatever he had sent from this phone 4 minutes ago was now in motion in places far from this diner, in federal buildings and newsrooms, and on servers that Rawlings and Greer Holt and every name in the black notebook did not have access to. The morning had arrived at a point that could not be reversed. But the room was not finished. Axel was still in the hands of Bishop's two men at the back of the diner, and the accounting for that had not yet been completed. And Greer Holt was in Tucson, 180 miles away, and whatever Rawlings reported to him in the next hour would move something in that direction that would need to be addressed. And Colt was in a hospital somewhere north of here, fighting for his life on a table, and did not yet know that the thing he had spent 2 years building in the dark had finally reached the light. Bishop looked at Lena. "We are not finished," he said, "but we are past the worst of it." He said it with the flat certainty of a man making an assessment of terrain rather than offering comfort, which was, she realized, exactly the kind of certainty she could trust. "Stay close." She looked at her daughter. Wren looked back at her with those level, serious eyes, and in them, Lena saw nothing that looked like fear. She saw instead the same quality she had seen in the culvert the night before, when Wren had pressed her small hands against a bleeding stranger's side without being asked, and had not removed them until help arrived. Whatever came next, they were inside the wall and not outside it. The dust from the Suburbans was still hanging in the air over Route 93 when Bishop turned fully back into the diner, and the full weight of what remained settled over the room like the heat settling over the valley floor. The outside threat had retreated, but retreat is not resolution. Every man in the diner understood that, and the silence they maintained in the minutes after Rawlings left was not the silence of men at rest. It was the silence of men waiting for the next thing to be addressed. Axel was still at the back of the room. The two men holding him had not changed their grip or their posture since they had stopped him from moving toward the hallway. They held him with the impersonal steadiness of men performing a function rather than expressing an emotion which was somehow more serious than anger would have been. Axel stood between them with his chin slightly raised and his eyes moving around the room in the careful measuring way of a man who is not ready to stop calculating even when the math has turned decisively against him. Bishop walked to the center of the room. He did not rush. He stopped 10 feet from Axel and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. The other men in the diner shifted their attention to this without being asked, to the way a room orients toward a thing of gravity. "How long?" Bishop said. The question was simple. Axel heard in it everything it contained, which was not just the question of duration, but the question of how deep and how far and how much had been handed to the wrong people under the name of the club. Axel said nothing for a moment. His jaw worked. 8 months, he said finally. His voice came out without the quality it usually carried, that smooth vice president's voice that had been useful in rooms where things needed to be managed. What came out instead was something stripped of that layer, something that sounded like what it was. They had his brother in a county facility on a charge that would not disappear unless Axel made it disappear. He had done what a man does when the person he would die for is being used as the instrument of his surrender. He had made the calculation that seemed survivable in the moment and had kept making it for 8 months until survivable had become something else entirely. Bishop listened to this. He gave it the full weight of his attention, which was the kind of attention that does not offer relief but does not dismiss either. He looked at the man he had ridden beside for 11 years, and he did not look away from what he saw there, which was both the betrayal and the reason for it existing in the same space, neither one canceling the other. When Axel finished, Bishop was quiet for a moment. "Your brother is out," Bishop said. "He has been out for 6 weeks. We got him moved to a minimum security facility in February, and he was released in March." I was going to tell you at the regional meeting next month. Axel stared at him. The thing that moved through Axel's face in the next 5 seconds was not something that had a clean name. It was the expression of a man absorbing the specific, irreversible shape of what he had done and what it had cost and what it had been predicated on that turned out not to be true. He had given 8 months of Colt's routes and schedules in the location of 2 years of evidence to men who were using the club's roads to move poison into the state, and the reason he had started had already been resolved without his knowledge, and none of the 8 months could be returned. He closed his eyes. Bishop looked at him for another long moment. His voice was quiet and final. "You are not my vice president," he said. "You are not my brother." He said this without heat, which made it more complete than heat would have. "As of this morning, you are not wearing our colors." He looked at the two men holding Axel. "Take him outside. Keep him separate until we are done here." Then he turned away, which was the most total statement he could make, and did not look at Axel again. The two men walked Axel out through the broken front door into the morning light, and the door frame swung empty behind them. Bishop stood in the middle of the diner. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up at the ceiling and exhaled once a long, controlled breath, the kind a man takes when he is setting something down that he has been carrying for a while without knowing it. Then he turned back to the room and was Bishop again, fully present, the accounting for the interior matter complete. Lena was standing at the counter with Ren beside her. The cast iron skillet was on the counter now. She had finally put it down. Bishop looked at her. "Rawlings will be picked up before the end of the day," he said. "The material I sent this morning is sufficient for federal warrants on him and 11 of the names in that notebook. His cartel contacts will know about the exposure within hours. Whatever Rawlings reports to your ex-husband in the next hour will not matter, because by the time Greer Holt understands what is moving toward him, it will already be too late to move away from it." Lena absorbed this. "In Greer," she said. Bishop looked at her steadily. "Greer Holt built something that took 4 years to build and 2 years to document," he said. "The routing numbers and the financial architecture in that notebook are specific enough that a federal forensic accounting team will be able to reconstruct the entire structure from the records. There is nowhere that money has moved that will not eventually be found." He paused. "He will run. People like Greer Holt always run when the walls start closing because they believe that the intelligence that built the structure can also find a way out of it. But the notebook is already in federal hands, and the accounts are already flagged. His passport will be on a watch list before noon." "How do you know all of this?" Lena said. Bishop was quiet for a moment in a way that suggested the answer to this was not a short one, and that this was not the moment for the long version. His phone rang. He pulled it from his cut and looked at the screen. Something passed through his expression that was brief and not entirely controllable, a flash of something that did not fit the architecture of his face, but was unmistakably there. He answered it and held the phone to his ear. He said nothing for a moment. He listened. Then he walked to the far side of the diner and stood with his back to the room again, the way he had when he was sending the photographs. His voice when he spoke was too low for Lena to hear the words, but she could hear the quality of it. The quality had changed. Something in the register of a man who is speaking to someone he has not spoken to in a very long time and is doing the work of compressing a very large amount of unsaid things into whatever words are available in this moment. The call lasted 4 minutes. When Bishop came back to the center of the room, his face had undergone a rearrangement that he had not entirely completed yet. He stood for a moment doing the completion work, and the men in the diner let him do it without looking at him directly, which was the courtesy of men who understand that there are moments that require privacy even in public. Then he looked at Wren. "The 3 words you told me," he said. "Colt taught you those words." Wren nodded. "Do you know what they mean?" Wren thought about this with the characteristic pause of a child who distinguishes between what she knows and what she thinks she knows. "They mean a place," she said. "A place only you know." Bishop looked at her for a moment. "They are the name of a location," he said. "A small property in Nevada. A place where Colt has been maintaining a second archive of the financial records. Digital copies separate from the notebook. Encrypted. The access code for the archive is embedded in those 3 words as a passphrase." He paused. "He gave those words to you because he knew you would hold them exactly right. Because a child remembers without trying to understand, and understanding is what gets people killed." He looked at the phone in his hand. "The woman who just called me," he said, "has been building a federal case around the same network that Colt has been documenting. She has spent 2 years assembling the legal framework, but the warrants, the chain of custody procedures, all the infrastructure required to take a body of evidence and translate it into prosecutions that will hold. What she has lacked is the evidence itself, the kind of specific, verifiable financial documentation that cannot be challenged in court." He stopped. He looked at Wren again, and the expression that had been working through his face since the phone call settled into something that was quiet and complete. "Her name is Sable Reeves," he said. "She is a special agent with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. She has been working this case from a field office in Las Vegas for the last 2 years, which is why no one in the county sheriff network knew her name or her face." He held the phone in both hands and looked down at it. "Colt is her father." The room received this in silence. Lena looked at Bishop. "He did not know she was working the case," Bishop said. "She did not know he was building the archive. They had been estranged for 6 years since she joined the Bureau, because Colt believed that his world and her work could not occupy the same space without one of them destroying the other. So he stayed away. He stayed away, and he spent 2 years building the most complete financial documentation of a cartel-linked corruption network in this state's history, and he kept it separate from everything, and he gave the access to it to an 8-year-old girl in a ditch on Route 93, because she was the only person in that moment who he trusted to hold it without trying to use it." He looked at Wren. "He knew the club would come," Bishop said. "He knew I would come. He knew that when you gave me those words, I would know what they meant, and I would make the call. And he knew that when I made the call, I would reach his daughter, who has the legal infrastructure, to turn what he built into something that cannot be undone in a courtroom." Wren held Bishop's gaze with the serious, still attention she brought to things that mattered. "Will he be okay?" she said. "Colt." Bishop's expression did something careful. "He is in surgery right now," he said. "The doctors say he is strong." He said this with the measured honesty of a man who will not make a promise he cannot keep, but will not withhold the portion of truth that offers some ground to stand on. "He is strong and he is stubborn, and he has spent 30 years making it out of situations that did not want him to make it out of." He paused. "I think he is going to want to hear about this morning." Wren nodded once, as though this confirmed what she had already privately determined. Lena looked at her daughter. The morning light was coming through the front windows now at a higher angle, the orange of early morning having shifted to the flat, honest gold of mid-morning. And in that light, Wren looked exactly like what she was, which was an 8-year-old girl in pajamas with bare feet on a linoleum floor and her pink windbreaker over her arm. Not a soldier, not a symbol, just a child who had made a series of clear-eyed decisions in the last 14 hours and had not been wrong about any of them. Lena felt something release in her chest that had been held tightly for 3 years. Not all of it. Not the part that would require more time and more distance and more mornings than this one to fully let go. but enough that the next breath came differently than the ones before it. Bishop reached into the inside of his leather cut. He produced a manila envelope thick and worn at the edges that he set on the counter between them, with a weight that was audible in the quiet of the room. It landed with the soft dense sound of paper currency in quantity. "There is $50,000 in there," he said. Lena started to speak. He raised one hand. "It is not negotiable, and it is not a gift." Colt was carrying club funds when they ran him off the road. "The money is owed to the people who were standing between our brother and the people who wanted him dead." He looked at her with the flat, direct regard that was his natural mode of communication. "Fix the door. Take your daughter somewhere worth living. Put her in a school that will know what to do with her." He said this last part looking at Ren, not at Lena, and his voice shifted slightly on it, carrying something that was not sentiment, but was close enough to it that the distinction felt minor. Lena looked at the envelope. 3 years of early mornings and empty highways and coffee pots, and the slow, patient work of building something from nothing after everything had been taken, and the thing that was going to change her life was sitting on the same Formica counter where she had refilled the Montana trucker's coffee cup this morning. "I need to ask you something," she said. Bishop waited. "The night he went off the road," she said. "Colt, did he know Axel was working against him?" Bishop was quiet for a moment. "He suspected," he said. He could not confirm it from the inside. "It is one of the reasons he was moving the notebook that night. He was trying to get it out before whoever was watching him inside the club could arrange something more final than a black SUV. He paused. He was running out of time, and he knew it. The night he chose to move was a calculated risk. It did not go the way he planned. He looked at the counter. "What happened in that culvert was not part of any plan I know about." He looked at Ren. "That part was yours." Ren considered this. "He told me the birds would know," she said. Bishop looked at her. "When he gave me the things to carry," she said, "before he went unconscious. He said, if the wrong people find you before Bishop does, go into the desert and find the birds and wait. He said the desert birds always know which way is safe." She said it with the matter-of-fact tone she used for things she had cataloged and filed as true, as if this were simply another entry in the field guide, another species identified and recorded. Bishop looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into the front pocket of his cut and produced something small. He held it in his palm and looked at it before he said anything, which was unusual for him, which suggested that the object had a weight that was not physical. It was a patch, small, embroidered, perhaps 3 inches across, a winged skull in precise black thread, the same design that marked every cut in the parking lot outside. But above the skull, rendered in gold thread that caught the morning light, as Bishop tilted his palm, was a small halo. Delicate and deliberate, the halo of something that has earned a designation beyond the ordinary categories. He came down to one knee in front of Ren. The floor creaked under his weight. He was at her eye level again, the way he had been in the first minutes, and up close she could see the deep lines of his face and the old scar along his jaw, and the particular quality of his eyes when the control was set aside, which was not soft exactly, but was human in a way that the control sometimes obscured. "You are 8 years old," he said, "and you have already done something that most people never do in a lifetime, which is look directly at something frightening and decide that it needs you more than you need to run from it." He held the patch out to her. "This is not a decoration. It is a statement of fact about what you are and what you have done." He paused. "Every person in every club in every state who flies our colors knows what this patch means." He looked at her with the full weight of his attention. "You show this to anyone wearing our cut anywhere in this country, and you tell them Preacher sent you. That is the name the road knows me by. He paused. You tell them Bishop sent you, and they will know that you are family, that you are protected, that if something needs doing for you, it will be done. Ren took the patch from his palm with both hands. She looked at it for a moment, turning it over, examining the gold thread of the halo with the same focused attention she brought to smooth stones and desert birds. Tell Colt, I hope he feels better, she said. Bishop looked at her. The expression on his face in that moment was one that Lena would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right language for. It was not simple. It had the complexity of something that has traveled a great distance and arrived changed. There was grief in it for the man in the hospital, and for the years of estrangement that had preceded this morning, and for the particular cost that doing necessary things in the world always extracts from the people willing to do them. There was something that was the opposite of grief for the child standing in front of him, holding a small embroidered patch with both hands. There was the specific quality of a man who has lived long enough in a world of hard truths that encountering something uncomplicated in its goodness produces in him not cynicism, but a response that is almost the opposite of cynicism, something closer to reverence. I will tell him, little bird, Bishop said. He stood. He turned to Lena and looked at her for a moment with the level, direct regard he had brought to everything since he walked through her front door. Sable Reeves will be here inside of 2 hours, he said. She will want the notebook and the access to the archive. She will have federal agents with her, and they will want statements from both of you. He paused. Tell them everything, every detail. Your ex-husband Rawlings, the trooper who questioned you last night, all of it. You have nothing to protect now, and you have nothing to fear from the truth. He said this last sentence with the particular weight of someone who understands both sides of that equation from personal experience. The truth is what we spent 2 years building this morning, and it is the only thing now that will hold. He walked to the front of the diner. He stopped in the broken doorway and looked out at the lot at the 150 men who had stood in the Nevada sun all morning, without complaint, waiting for their president to tell them what came next. He looked at the highway and the desert beyond it, the pale rock formations and the brutal sky and the wukmon indifferent beauty of a landscape that asks nothing of you and protects nothing about you and simply endures. He turned back and looked at Lena one more time. For what it is worth, he said, you built something out here that deserved to last. He looked around the diner at the cheap booths and the dusty jukebox and the cracked formica counter, and his voice had in it the tone of a man saying something he means without decoration. Not many people have the kind of steady that takes. Then he walked out through the broken door into the morning light. A minute later, the engines began. Not all at once. In a rolling sequence that moved through the lot, the way sound moves through a canyon, one voice finding the next building from individual to collective until the whole parking lot was vibrating with it, and the coffee in the pots on the burners was rippling again, and the silverware was singing against the formica, and the windows were talking in their frames. Lena and Ren walked to the broken doorway and stood side by side in the frame, not touching, just standing close watching. The column formed with the same unhurried precision with which it had arrived, bikes pulling out of the lot, in sequence falling into formation on Route 93, heading south toward the horizon they had come from. The sound moved down the highway ahead of them, a rolling declaration that filled the valley floor and bounced off the rock formations to the east, and climbed toward the flat blue sky above the Mojave, and slowly over the course of several minutes faded, until it was gone. The desert returned to itself. The heat pressed down. A single crow crossed the sky above the highway from west to east without apparent urgency. Somewhere behind the diner, a soda can rolled in the morning wind across the caliche and came to rest against a smooth river stone. The dust and ember stood in the morning sun with its broken front door and its flickering E in the neon sign and the manila envelope on the counter inside in the small embroidered patch clutched in the hands of an 8-year-old girl, and the desert around it was exactly what it had always been, which was everything and nothing merciless and sufficient. Sable Reeves arrived at 10:30. She came in a government-plated sedan, followed by two black SUVs that were different from Rawlings in every way that mattered, which was that the people inside them had badges and warrants and the authority to use both in the direction that things needed to go. She was 30 years old, and she had her father's jaw and her father's eyes, that pale, washed-out gray that had looked up at Wren from the floor of a culvert 14 hours ago, and she moved through the diner with the compact, economical precision of someone who has trained herself out of anything extraneous. She sat down at the counter. Her agents moved through the space with quiet professionalism, documenting, photographing, establishing the legal chain that would carry what had happened this morning from this diner into federal courtrooms and not fall apart under examination. One of them repaired the front door with a short piece of board and 4 screws from a toolkit he produced from the back of the SUV, which Lena noted without comment. Sable put the notebook on the counter in front of her. She had brought it from wherever Bishop had transmitted the photographs, or rather, she had received the photographs and then sent agents to retrieve the physical notebook from Bishop's hands before he left the property, a transaction that Lena had not witnessed but understood had occurred. The notebook sat between them, small and dense, and very still, doing nothing except existing and being what it was. Sable looked at Lena. "I need to tell you something before we start," Sable said. Her voice had the quality of her father's voice in its fundamental architecture, the same controlled depth, though it had been built over different experiences into a different instrument. She looked at her hands on the counter for a moment. "I have been building a legal case around this network for 2 years. I had the framework, and I had the witness statements, and I had the forensic accounting models, but I did not have the primary source financial documentation that would make the case unassailable." She paused. "I did not know my father was building it. We had not spoken since I joined the Bureau. He believed his world and my work were incompatible." She said this without visible emotion, which was its own kind of statement. "I received the photographs this morning from a phone I did not recognize. It took me 40 seconds to understand what I was looking at, and approximately 20 more seconds to understand who must have sent it, because the specific details in that notebook are not things that anyone other than the person who gathered them could have known." She looked at Lena. "He sent it through Bishop because he knew Bishop would make the call. He built in the backup of the archive and the passphrase because he knew that if something happened to him before he could get the notebook out, he needed a channel that did not go through me directly, because my phone and my contacts were potentially compromised by the same network I was investigating." Lena listened to this. "He built it so it would survive without him," Lena said. Sable was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. They looked at each other across the counter of a diner in the Nevada desert, and in the space between them was the specific understanding of women who have spent time being the people that things survive through, which is a different kind of strength than the strength that builds the things in the first place and is no less necessary. Wren had come to sit on one of the counter stools. She was still holding the patch. She had not put it down since Bishop had pressed it into her hands. She was looking at Sable with the full-level attention she gave to things she was in the process of understanding. "He said you would come," Wren said. "Colt. He said if Bishop came, the right people would come." Sable looked at the girl. Something moved through her face. He said that Sable said, yes. Sable looked at Ren for a long moment. She looked at the embroidered patch in the girl's hands and at the pajamas and the bare feet, and she did what very few people manage to do in Ren's presence, which was to look at her without adjusting her expression into something more appropriate for an 8-year-old. She simply looked at her as she was, which was what the girl required. The federal agents worked the room around them. Outside in the parking lot, a third sedan had arrived, and 2 more people were photographing the skid marks from the Suburbans and documenting the ground of a morning that had happened and could not unhappen. Rawlings was in federal custody in Las Vegas by 11:15, a fact that came through on Sable's phone as she was taking Lena's statement, delivered in the flat, brief language of agents communicating operational updates. The agents who picked him up reported that he had not resisted, which was consistent with the behavior of a man who understands that the architecture of the situation has shifted beyond the point where resistance changes anything. Greer Holt was located at a private airfield outside Tucson at 11:40. He had a bag packed and a charter flight booked to a jurisdiction that maintained no extradition treaty with the United States, which was consistent with the behavior of a man who understood, as Bishop had predicted, that his passport would be flagged and had identified what he believed was a window. The window was not, in fact, a window. 2 FBI vehicles and a Department of Justice warrant were waiting at the airfield before his car reached the gate. He was taken into custody without incident, which was also consistent with the behavior of a man who builds things and directs things, but does not himself do the physical work of confrontation. Lena received this information sitting at her own counter, drinking her own coffee, and she held it for a moment in both hands, the information and the coffee both, and she did not perform anything about it. She did not cry, and she did not feel relief exactly, or not only relief, she felt the specific quality of something that has been unresolved for years arriving at its resolution, which is quieter than people expect. It does not announce itself. It settles, like silt settling in water that has stopped moving. The water clarifies and you can see through it, and what you see through it is simply what was always there, the ground, the basic fact of the bottom. The federal agents finished at 1:30 in the afternoon. Sable was the last to leave. She stood at the repaired doorway, which still showed the splintered wood of the forced entry along the frame and would need a proper carpenter before it was fully right again. She had the notebook in an evidence bag under her arm and the access credentials for the digital archive Colt had maintained on the Nevada property, and she had Lena's full statement and Ren's account given in the patient, precise language of a child who distinguishes carefully between what she observed and what she inferred. She stood at the doorway and looked back at Ren, who was at the counter eating a bowl of cereal because it was past noon, and she had not had anything since early morning. "I am going to see him," Sable said. "My father, when he is out of surgery." She said this to the room, not to anyone specifically. She said it the way a person says something they have decided while they were doing something else, the decision arriving in the present tense, though it was made somewhere in the last 2 hours. Ren looked up from the cereal. "Tell him Ren says the birds were right," she said. Sable looked at her. "I will," she said. She walked out to the sedan. The government vehicles pulled out of the gravel lot onto Route 93 and headed north, and the Dust and Ember went back to being what it always was, which was a small building in a large desert, very still in the afternoon heat. Lena stood at the counter for a long time after the last vehicle disappeared over the horizon. The manila envelope was still there. The cash in it was real, and it was hers, and it was sufficient to do what Bishop had said, to fix what needed fixing and move what needed moving and start what needed starting. She had known from the moment it landed on the counter that she was going to take it, and she had known that it would be the last money she ever handled in this building, which was a fact she was only now allowing herself to fully understand. She was going to leave, not in fear this time, not with $200 and a sleeping 5-year-old and the rearview mirror carefully not looked at. This time she was going to lock the front door from the outside and drive north with her daughter in the seat beside her and the envelope in the bag and the legal matters in motion behind her. And whatever came next was going to be something she moved toward rather than something she moved away from. She thought about 3 years of desert mornings and the particular quality of the silence out here that was not the silence of safety, but had served as safety's substitute for long enough that she had confused the two. She thought about the crow this morning crossing the sky from west to east without urgency, and the coffee rippling before the sound arrived, and the sound arriving like a wall, and the wall turning out to be the thing that stood between her and everything that had been coming since Phoenix. She thought about a man in a culvert with his blood in the dirt and her daughter's small hands pressing without being asked to. She looked at Ren. Ren had finished the cereal and was sitting on the counter stool with the embroidered patch laid flat on the formica in front of her, looking at it with the cataloging attention of someone who is deciding how to carry a thing, which category of important thing it belongs to, what it goes next to in the collection of what matters. She looked up and found her mother looking at her. "Are we going now?" she said. "Yes," Lena said. "Soon." Ren slid off the stool. She picked up the pink windbreaker from the end of the counter where she had laid it that morning. She put the embroidered patch in the left front pocket, the same pocket where the canvas package had traveled for 14 hours, and she zipped the pocket closed with the small, definitive sound of a thing properly secured. She looked at her mother. "I am ready," she said. They left the Nevada desert on a Thursday afternoon in late August, driving north on Route 93, with the sun beginning its descent behind the western ridgeline, and the air through the open windows carrying the particular dry scent of sage and caliche that Lena knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life as the smell of starting over. The dust and ember receded in the rearview mirror, smaller and smaller, the cracked neon sign. Dark in the daylight, the parking lot empty, the front door repaired as well as a single board and 4 screws could repair it, which was not well but was sufficient for a building that was no longer hers to worry about. She did not look at the mirror after the building was gone. There was nothing behind her that she needed to see. 6 months later, a letter arrived at the address in Colorado that they had left with Sable Reeves the afternoon of the federal investigation. It came in a standard white envelope with no return address, postmarked from a hospital administrative office in Nevada. Inside was a smaller envelope, pale blue, sealed with tape. And inside that was a single sheet of paper folded twice with handwriting on it that was small and cramped and careful, the handwriting of a man who understood that the things he wrote might eventually be read by people he had not written them for. There were no case notes in this letter, no routing numbers, no initials or dates or names. There was a short paragraph that had been written in the particular language of a man who is more comfortable with actions than words and has done his best with the materials available. It said that the birds were always right about which way was safe. It said that Little Bird was a good name for someone who knows where to fly. It said that the thing she had held for him had reached the place it was always meant to go, and that what came from that was already in motion in courtrooms and offices and institutions that did not know an 8-year-old girl in bare feet had been the final link in a chain 2 years in the making. And that was exactly right, because the people who hold things often do not know how much they are holding, and that is often why the things survive. At the bottom of the page below the signature was a postscript in slightly different handwriting, slightly different ink, as if it had been added separately, and perhaps at a different time. It said that the halo on the patch was accurate. Wren read the letter sitting at the kitchen table in the Colorado house, with the afternoon light coming through the window behind her and her field guide open to the page on desert birds. She read it twice with the unhurried attention she brought to things that mattered. Then she folded it back into its pale blue envelope and put it in the drawer of her bedside table next to the pouch of smooth stones she had carried out of Nevada and the field guide she had consulted on the drive north, and the pink windbreaker folded at the bottom of the drawer, with the embroidered patch still zipped safe in the front pocket. She closed the drawer. She went back to the kitchen table and finished her homework, and looked up once at the window at the Colorado evening sky, which was different from the Nevada sky, higher and cooler, and a different kind of vast, and she watched a single hawk cross it from south to north, on a current she could not see from where she was sitting, moving with the easy, unhurried certainty of something that knows exactly which way is safe.